Thank you, Cathaoirleach and members of Seanad Éireann. First of all, I bring you the warmest fraternal greetings and best wishes from the 800,000 men and women who are affiliated through their trade unions to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I want to thank you particularly for your very kind invitation to address you, which for me is a singular honour and a privilege, and thank you for that. So, in the course of my remarks, I propose to first review the circumstances which led to the 1913 lockout, which was the most serious industrial dispute ever in Ireland. I'll then recall what happened during the lockout, how it ended, and what happened in the aftermath. And I will then move on to try and consider the relevance of this seminal act for contemporary Ireland, as you have suggested, Cathaoirleach. Well, when the drivers and conductors of the Dublin Tramway Company abandoned their trams at 20 to 10 on the 26th of August 1913 and pinned on the red hand badge of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union on their lapels, it was the culmination of 5 years of fairly intense industrial and political activism in Ireland. James Larkin had come to Dublin in 1907 as the representative of the British National Union of Dock Labourers, and James Connolly was at that time still in the United States. By the summer of 1908, Larkin's organising efforts were meeting fairly strong resistance from employers. In July, 120 dockers were locked out, and the management of the dispute was taken out of Larkin's hands by the General Secretary of the NUDL in London, a man called James Sexton. But undeterred, Larkin continued organising and staged a strike of dockers in Cork in November, and this time with some more success, achieving a considerable rise in wages. But relations with Sexton and the NUDL continued to deteriorate by virtue of the union executive's refusal to back the organising efforts that Larkin was engaged in financially. And eventually Larkin was suspended from that union on the 7th of December 1908, and in consequence he went on to found the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which is the forerunner of SIPTU, in January of 1909. But the ITGWU grew quickly and spread throughout Ireland. It became embroiled in many epic struggles with employers for the right to organise, including a national railway strike in 1911 and involving the Wexford foundries in 1911 and 1910. And in due course, Larkin was joined in this by James Connolly and William O'Brien. But recognising that industrial activism alone couldn't adequately achieve their goals, the three of these people decided to pursue parliamentary representation for workers as well. And they saw an opportunity for a domestic parliament when the passage of the Second Home Rule Bill happened. And so it was that a motion was passed to found the Irish Labour Party at the Trade Union Congress meeting in Clonmel in 1912. And this was put in the name of James Connolly and supported by Larkin and William O'Brien. Now, notwithstanding the move into the political arena, organising activity continued such that there were 30 major industrial disputes in Dublin alone between January and August of 1913. This was of such concern to the authorities that the Lord Mayor of the time, a man called Lorcan Sherlock, proposed a new system of conciliation to the unions and to the Chamber of Commerce. And in this endeavour, he enjoyed the support of the Archbishop of Dublin, Dr. William Walsh, who was a man widely respected both by employers and unions. And for a while it looked as if the initiative might bring industrial peace to the city, but it was not to be. We're told by Pádraig Yates, who is the author of, I think, the definitive history of the lockout, that the summer of 1913 was a glorious summer, with 8 weeks of almost unbroken sunny weather. Expectations for a successful horse show at the RDS were very high, with unprecedented numbers of visitors, even causing some of the hotels to have to turn away guests. There was a rumour of a possible form of industrial action in the tramway company, sufficient to move the Irish Times to warn prospective strikers that whatever legitimation their grievances might have, they would arouse public hostility if they engaged in industrial action. The truth, of course, was that James Larkin and William Martin Murphy, the owner of the tramway company, were really locked in a power struggle. To be credible as a transport union, the ITGWU needed to represent the workers in this major transport utility. And equally, Murphy was determined to keep the ITGW out of his companies at all cost. And by requiring his staff to sign a pledge not to join or remain in membership of the ITGW on pain of dismissal, well, he made a strike inevitable, really, because he dismissed 240 people, and so Larkin obviously had to respond. Now, William Martin Murphy's trump card was to unite the employers of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce in a joint effort to break the ITGW by locking out all those who refused to sign and to renounce Larkin. And it was an effective antidote to the corresponding policy of Larkin, which was to use the sympathetic strike to advance his cause. And so began, anyway, the worst dispute in Irish labour history. It went on for 5 months, from August of 1913 to January of 1914, and caused enormous suffering, not just to the 25,000 or so men who were involved in the dispute, but to the women and to the wives and to the children as well. And as you will appreciate, welfare systems were rudimentary or even non-existent at that time. And it was only with the support of the Trade Union Congress in Britain, who raised £93,000, substantial sum of money, I think equivalent to about 10 million today, and were able to fund the sending of food chips to Dublin that really kept starvation at bay. I was very pleased at Cathaoirleach on the National Day of Commemoration for the 1913 lockout to be able to invite Frances O'Grady, a lady with a very good Irish-sounding name, to lay a wreath at the Larkin statue in O'Connell Street. Indeed, it is the case that the plight of the working-class people of Dublin in 1913 was appalling from a social perspective. Over 80,000 families lived in tenements, mostly in 1 or 2 rooms. The middle class had decamped to the suburbs, leaving the working class in possession of the city's subsoil, and in the words of Pádraig Yates, its distinct smell complemented that of social decay and economic starvation. It was in these awful conditions that families tried to subsist on average labouring wages of around 18 shillings a week. So one didn't have to look very far to see the causes of labour militancy in the Dublin of 1913. But the labour militancy was to exact a high price in human suffering. Within days of the commencement of the lockout, 2 men, James Nolan and John Byrne, died under the batons of the Dublin Metropolitan Police in civil unrest that had broken out in the city. On the 30th of August, James Connolly was sentenced to 3 months in jail, having refused to recognise the court. And the authorities banned a public meeting planned for Sackville Street on Sunday, the 31st of August. But James Larkin vowed that he would speak anyway. Now, alarmed by the drift of this thing and the tactics of Connolly and Larkin, William O'Brien and the other leaders of the Trades Council feared that if large numbers of ITGW members were present in Sackville Street, which is the O'Connell Street of today, it would risk very serious disturbances indeed. And to avoid this, they organised an alternative event, which was a march to Croydon Park in Fairview, and 10,000 members took part in the march, and it went off more or less peacefully. But Larkin insisted on fulfilling his promise, and accompanied by Helena Maloney, he duly arrived in disguise at the Imperial Hotel, which is now Cleary's in O'Connell Street, and he had pre-booked a room there in the name of Donnelly. It was an unusual situation in one sense, because the hotel, of course, was actually owned by Mr. William Martin Murphy as well. So at 1:20 anyway, he appeared on the balcony of the hotel, and he briefly addressed the crowd. The police immediately moved to arrest him, sparking the protests that we know about, and they responded very ferociously to those protests by baton charging the crowd. And within 4 to 5 minutes, nearly, I think, 400 people were seriously injured. And there was an independent witness, a barrister by the name of Thomas Patton, who subsequently testified to the Commission of Inquiry into this incident, and he said, "Police used their batons all the time and with great force, and almost invariably on the heads of people. I should say that the demeanour of the crowd before these charges took place seemed to me to be quite respectable. I did not see any disturbance or riot or any attempt at disturbance or riot." Now, needless to say, the savagery of this incident deeply embittered the strikers, yet the employers were also determined at this stage on unconditional surrender. Separate attempts by bodies such as the TUC in Britain, Thomas Kettle's Industrial Peace Committee, and indeed the Ascot Committee, and by enlightened employers like Edward Lead the Draper, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Lorcan Sherlock, and Archbishop Walsh separately to negotiate a settlement, or even an industrial truce, were all rebuffed by the employers. And eventually, after 5 months, unconditional surrender was in effect what they got. Larkin's inability to convince the British unions to support him by engaging in sympathetic strikes undermined his core strategy. At a special conference in Britain on the 9th of December 1913, the Trade Union Congress voted decisively against his call for sympathetic strikes. Railway union leaders led the charge, arguing that if they acceded to this demand, it would set such a precedent that their members, that's the railway workers, would never be at work because, of course, they'd always be required to engage in support of other workers. While, this was clearly an understandable viewpoint, it was really the beginning of the end for Larkin. By January 1914, in the face of a united employer front and with his members and their families destitute, he really had to advise them to get whatever terms they could for a return to work. Now, the bitterness of this outcome can be sensed in what James Connolly wrote in Forward, his paper at the time. He said, "And so we Irish workers must go down into hell, bow our backs to the lash of the slave driver, let our hearts be seared by the iron of his hatred, and instead of the sacramental wafer of brotherhood and common sacrifice, eat the dust of defeat and betrayal." For some, of course, no terms were available for a return to work. They were blacklisted by the employers. Some of you may remember the series Trumpet City and the character Fitz, who joined the army. Like that, their only chance was to join the fight of the Great War, which was beginning in Europe in 1914. And within 3 years, many of them were dead, as indeed was Connolly, and others, like the bricklayers' leader, Richard O'Carroll, a prominent figure in the 1913 lockout, who became involved in nationalist politics. He was shot like Sheehy Scappington by Captain J.C. Bowen Courthurst during Easter week. Larkin had gone to America in November 1914, exhausted and suffering from the depression after the trauma of the lockout. He was imprisoned there, convicted of criminal syndicalism, not to return until the 23rd of April 1923, having been deported by a young J. Edgar Hoover. Nevertheless, the ITGW and the union movement proved remarkably resilient. At the end of 1913, the ITGW had 22,935 members, compared with 24,135 in January. But by 1920, it had grown to 120,000 members. And indeed, by 1918, the union was strong enough to mount a general strike against conscription. And much of this was due to the organisational skills of William O'Brien. When Larkin eventually returned to Ireland, he found the ITGW firmly under the control of O'Brien. Inevitably, there was a clash, and Larkin lost. He went on to found the Workers' Union of Ireland and took most of the Dublin membership of the ITGW with him. And this precipitated a long-lasting divide in the labour movement, both industrial and political, which was not healed, as you said, until the Irish Congress of Trade Unions was formed in 1959, 12 years after Larkin's death. The ITGW and the Workers' Union of Ireland were fully united in 1990 with the formation of SIPTU, which today has 250,000 members. That O'Brien became so influential in the ITGW is itself interesting. He was not originally a member of the union because he was a tailor by trade and so a member of a craft union, albeit that he was a key figure in the lockout by virtue of his officership of the Trades Council. He was Vice President of the Dublin Trades Council. But he did join up with the ITGW and he rose quickly in influence within the union, becoming treasurer in 1919. He was a great admirer of James Connolly, and it may be that as Connolly became more and more preoccupied with the citizen army and militant nationalism, he was happy perhaps to leave the more mundane task of union building to William O'Brien. In the folk memory of Irish trade unionism, William O'Brien has often been presented in a more negative light than his contemporaries Connolly and Larkin. However, his biographer, Father Tom Morrissey, S.J., reassesses him as a much more rounded character of great intellect who died widely honoured but not widely liked. The formation of the Citizen Army was a response to the type of police partiality displayed in Sackville Street on the 31st of August, and its function really, initially at any rate, was to protect strikers against such attacks in the future. But it moved on from that role to play a key part in the 1916 Rising, as you know. And in some respects, I think the role of the labour movement generally in those particular events has been somewhat understated or unrecognised. Indeed, it was a tragic paradox of the time that those who fought in the class struggle of 1913 should end up on opposite sides a short time later. It is said that one reason why there was such initial hostility to the captured volunteers after the Rising was that so many men, veterans of 1913, were fighting in the trenches at the time. Reflecting on what was by any standards an out-and-out class struggle in 1913, it's perhaps puzzling that it didn't have more of an influence on the polity of the emerging Irish state. Given the contribution of these same actors to the subsequent independence struggle, it's remarkable that Kevin O'Higgins could say in the early years of the new Irish government, "We are the most conservative revolutionaries in history." It demonstrates the extent to which Irish nationalism has trumped political ideology. And there's an interesting contrast here with an event that happened in Sweden a few years later. In 1931, there was a strike in the wood pulp industry in a town called Odalen. And during a demonstration by union members in support of the strike, the local police shot 5 people dead. And this had such an impact on the Swedish psyche that the Social Democrats swept the power in 1932 and remained continuously in office until 1976. The Nordic Social Democratic model that they created remains today a byword for economic efficiency, equality and social cohesion. On any indicators of social progress, Nordic social market economies lead the world. By contrast, social democracy has had a harder time finding its feet in Ireland. Perhaps the reason is that since the foundation of the state, most important issues, even those related to our membership of the EU, have been conceptualised in terms of independence rather than of class interest. This reality, together with the overhang of the Northern Ireland situation, has consolidated a party structure which never aligned with the broad European typology of conservative, liberal and social democratic parties. The Labour Party that Connolly, Larkin and O'Brien founded in 1912 has never been able to break through an electoral straitjacket, with never less than 60% of the voters tend to prefer or tend to vote more on the centre-right of the political spectrum. On the other hand, while Ireland is firmly part of the liberal market economy grouping of Anglo-Saxon countries, it has at times exhibited some counter-tendencies. Foremost among them is an interventionist industrial policy, and between 1987 and 2009, a sophisticated model of social partnership. In this respect, it was closer to the Nordic approach. The difference is that the Nordic institutions are more firmly embedded in what Peter Kassenstein's seminal work on small open economies, which was published in 1985, described as an ideology of social partnership. This kind of conviction does not or did not underpin the Irish model, and lacking firm philosophical roots, it didn't survive the economic cataclysm of 2008. In time, I think this will be seen as a public policy mistake. Katzenstein's core thesis is that institutions are crucial to success. They may need to be reformed as circumstances change, but they should not be dispensed with lightly or without compelling reasons for so doing. That said, it must also be acknowledged that there has never been an overt public hostility to trade unions. No political party has ever made it a platform to attack them or to attack trade union rights, as has, for example, the Tories in Britain or the Republicans in the United States. Perhaps this too has something to do with Labour's role in the foundation of the state. Nevertheless, the reality is that the central objective that the women and men of 1913 fought for, the right of workers to choose their representatives and to have them bargain collectively with employers on their behalf, has never been secured. Indeed, it is actively opposed by employers' organisations, by the IDA, by the Supreme Court, and by some legislators who fear that granting a legal right to collective bargaining would inhibit foreign direct investment. But why this should be so when this right is enshrined in ILO Conventions number 87 and 98, in fact, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and is the norm in virtually every other European country, even Britain, is a mystery to me, I must say. So, we can erect statues to the 1913 leaders, we can name bridges after them, we can hold national days of commemoration to salute their sacrifice, but so long as their great-grandchildren are deprived of the basic human right that they set out to achieve, then we don't really honour their memory. To some extent, I think, the events of 1913 are viewed exclusively in a historical context, the product of material conditions which have no relevance today. This would be to fail to understand the enduring nature of some of the influences involved, I submit. Globalisation is one such influence. The capitalist world of 1913 was smaller than today, but no less globalised if you allow for the technological advances that have happened in the meantime. It was a time of much industrial conflict across Europe as workers and capital owners struggled with issues of distributional justice. For many, it seemed as if the world then had reached the limits of economic progress. And yet, it was all to collapse into the chaos and slaughter of World War I in 1914. For its part, organised labour was only to the task of preventing millions of its own members from killing each other in that conflict, one of our greatest historical failures, undoubtedly. And I think the lesson from this is that our well-being, our peace, indeed our world, is very, very fragile. The current phase of globalisation, which can largely be identified with the deregulation of capital markets, began in the 1980s. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and the decision of China to go capitalist by decree greatly accelerated the process. But one effect was to add 1.5 billion with a B, additional workers to the pre-existing industrial workforce of 950 million. Effectively, this changed the balance of power between capital and labour, and with the increased mobility of capital and financialisation meant that the collective bargaining power of labour was diminished. Investment decisions became crucial to economic sustainability, and so multinational corporations achieved much more leverage over corporate tax policies and over labour market regulation in countries that sought that investment. Ireland is a particular manifestation of this phenomenon, being described rather pejoratively by Father Kirby and others as a competition state. But interestingly, the change that I've just described was attended by considerable stability, with relatively low inflation alongside global robust economic growth. And policymakers thought, I think, that through policy alone they had achieved a new kind of equilibrium. Alan Greenspan referred to it as the Great Moderation. But it was really only a chimera. Reduced earning power consequent upon weaker unions with diminished bargaining strength was compensated for by easily available credit. People invested in property, which appreciated in value quickly and created a wealth effect, which more or less, I suppose, confused or disguised the anemic levels of earned income growth. And we know, all of us, we know now how that ended. And when the financial crisis hit in 2008, rapidly increasing unemployment and precarious working contracts had a certain chilling effect on the willingness of workers to oppose austerity policies in a sustained way across Europe. Youth unemployment levels of 50% in some countries, 7 million of them not in education or training, the so-called NEETs, and an overall unemployment cohort of 26 million people in Europe is as close to a social catastrophe as you can get. Keynesian demand management approaches were rejected in the 1970s because of perceived inability to counter the stagflation caused by the two oil crises of the time. And for a while, post the Lehman's collapse, it looked as if neoliberalism would also be rejected. But the neoliberals regrouped, and by the G20 meeting in the summer of 2010, austerity was installed as the policy to counter recession. Paradoxically, Barack Obama was the only Keynesian left standing, but the recovery in the US, in my opinion, is testimony to his wisdom. It is puzzling that there was not a more robust embrace of social democracy given the catastrophic failure of neoliberalism. A possible explanation may be the absence of a persuasive alternative narrative to austerity. People did not believe that another way was possible, and this is reflected, I think, to some extent in the electoral failure of social democratic parties, Australia, Norway and Germany being the most recent manifestation of this failure to convince. Right across Europe, unions defaulted to the time-honoured path of protest, but this was not of itself a sufficient response because nowhere, in truth, has it made a real difference. In the concluding part of his magnum opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, John Maynard Keynes reflected on the potency of ideas over a period of time, and he said, sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. When the financial crisis began in earnest, following the collapse of Lehman Brothers in mid-September 2008, Congress campaigned on an essential Keynesian response under the banner of a better, fairer way. It became clear, however, that orthodox economic opinion would have none of it. We were virtually alone. We realised that our capacity to undermine the meta-narrative of austerity was unequal to the scale of opposing opinion. And for this reason, we instituted a considerable reorientation of our resources, and it has paid off, I must say. By virtue of the quality of its analysis, the Nevin Economic Institute, which we created to engage in the battle of ideas from a social democratic perspective, is gradually gaining some purchase on the attention of policymakers, parliamentarians, I think, and the public as well. Now, not least in importance is its role in equipping our own members to engage in public discourse. Understanding the reality that the way EMU is structured, and absent the facility to devalue, the burden of adjustment in the event of an economic shock will fall on workers. This is the key. Understanding this is the key to the future, because this is the essential cause of much of our difficulty. The fact that the institutions of EMU are designed on the lines of the German Bundesbank means that German ordoliberalism is the policy effectively being followed. However, the manner in which that is mediated through the Troika means that it appears here as hard-nosed neoliberalism, unlike in Germany, where it is moderated by its social market economy context. Therefore, the key to a more equitable burden sharing ultimately requires a rebalancing of the institutions of EMU to allow for a social Europe in which the independence and power of the ECB is complemented by institutions appropriate to the social market economy. In other words, the ECB needs to move closer to the approach of the Federal Reserve of the United States, having not as its remit just price stability, but the broader conduct of economic affairs, including unemployment. Now, it seems unlikely that significant political momentum to achieve such an objective can be mobilised without a renaissance of social democracy in Europe, an event which does not seem imminent just at the moment. Nevertheless, recapturing the social policy ambitions of the Delors era in Europe is the task of the European Trade Union Confederation, in which Congress tries to play an active part. And so thus it is that the imperative of both industrial and political representation of workers reasserts itself again, as it did during that tumultuous period between 1908 and 1913. It is important to come to the realisation that the social market economy must be allowed to function in a way that allows for systems of collective bargaining to facilitate distribution of justice and the opportunity for a decent job for all. The alternative, I'm very serious about this, the alternative, because we have seen it in a number of European countries, is an acceleration of support for populist, right-wing, anti-European and anti-immigrant parties. Now, when Larkin came to Dublin, the Castle authorities, the British authorities at the time, didn't really want to take him on in conflict. And why? Because of the way that he was able to organise even the police into his union in Belfast when he organised there a big strike in 1906. In the heightened nationalist fervour of the times, that would have been a considerable worry to them. And many employers were reticent as well about taking him on. But William Martin Murphy put steel into those employers. He was an unusual phenomenon in the Ireland of 1913. Catholic nationalist entrepreneur in a city dominated by Protestant unionist businessmen, yet they accepted his leadership of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. Murphy's cause was not actually a dispute over pay and conditions. It was to get rid of Larkin and the syndicalism that he practiced. The sympathetic strike was regarded as a dangerous weapon in the hands of women and men whose circumstances were so bad that they had nothing else to lose. Most of all, he hated Larkin because he had an analysis of what caused these poor conditions in the first place. So once again, the importance of ideas comes out. What was exceptional about Larkin, of course, was his charisma and his leadership. What was exceptional about those who followed him was their solidarity and their willingness to suffer for his gospel, his divine gospel of discontent, as he calls it. In some respects, the labour movement regained ground lost more quickly than might have been expected after 1913. By 1919, the International Labour Office had been instituted, awarding as of right many of the protections William Martin Murphy sought to deny to the ITGWU. By 1919, also, the democratic programme here, reflecting the values of labour, had been promulgated. The recovery of trade union strength was helped by the demand for labour and economic conditions associated with the war. Sadly, however, the return of Larkin in 1923 from the United States led to a virtual civil war over control of the transport union. As a result, trade unions were marginalised from economic and social policy making for most of the next 35 years. It's hard to deny that this was not a squandering of all of the effort and hardship associated with 1913. It's the reason why Congress today remains so protective of the all-island unified structure instituted in 1959. It was a settlement which created the largest civil society organisation in Ireland, unique in European terms, in having one trade union centre for 2 jurisdictions. The acceptance of the sui generis nature of Congress has allowed it to stake out some common ground for workers of all religions and political persuasions to oppose sectarianism and violence over the last 40 difficult years in Northern Ireland. But the core mission of trade unionism to organise workers to force a more just distribution of wealth created by markets remains as it always has been. This mission is predicated on a belief that all human beings are morally equal, we all have an equal entitlement to self-determination, all life chances should be as equal as possible, and social justice is a precondition of liberty. Moreover, we believe that capitalism does not exist independently of society, and it is proper for the democratic will to be asserted over business and private power. Markets do not regulate themselves, and best outcomes do not happen spontaneously. But the biggest challenge, I think, facing all of us today, all of us in this room as well, is to find ways to mitigate the social and economic risks to which people are exposed during their normal lives. The very rich may have the means to insulate themselves from some, but actually not all, of those risks. The rest of us need to band together for protection, and that really is the purpose of the welfare state. In recent years, high levels of public debt and an ageing demographic, bringing with it high pension and health costs, has undermined the sustainability of the welfare state. In the future, it will only be possible to achieve sustainability with high levels of social investment. And this, in turn, will require higher labour force participation rates and jobs capable of sustaining the tax base to provide the revenue to fund that social investment. In other words, decent work. As things stand, the trend actually is in the opposite direction. Many of our citizens having an increasingly precarious relationship with the labour market through zero-hours contracts and the like. Indeed, it is the case that the welfare system we have is being increasingly used to subsidise employers paying low pay. This is not sustainable. In the same way, the retreat from defined benefit pension schemes is transferring risks through defined contribution schemes to the individual, first of all, but ultimately to the state, because all of us, none of us can have a situation where our older people are left in destitution, as an abject poverty. The state would have to step in. So there's this enormous movement of risk taking place. And decent work is now, and will increasingly become, an imperative for all industrialised countries. The only way to achieve decent work is through collective bargaining. The need for workers to organise and to bargain collectively with employers for distributional justice is as relevant today as it was in the past. The values which inspired the men and women of 1913 are, in fact, timeless. In Pádraig Yates' marvellously detailed account of the lockout, there's a poignant little story towards the end of it about the fate of some of those who were involved in the lockout. And I want to conclude with it because, for me, it captures the tragedy of the whole thing. And it reminds me of the weight of history on the shoulders of those of us whose duty it is to try to lead the present trade union movement. The story tells how, in 1914, a group of ITGWU men who were unable to win reinstatement on the docks because of their involvement with Larkin had joined the Dublin Fusiliers in block. They were part of the regular army that held the line in Flanders, while Kitchener's mass volunteer army was training in Britain. On the 24th of April 1915, they took part in an attack in a village called St. Julian near Ypres in Flanders. They advanced, as the book says, in faultless order to within 100 yards of the village, and then their lines were swept away by machine gun fire. The handful who crawled back gave 3 cheers for Jim Larkin, just as if they were once more outside Liberty Hall. Thank you, Carla. Thank you.